All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us in this July day and webinar. We know that we've been a little on a hiatus for webinars, but we did want to come back here and to give you guys an update on the 86th legislative session. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We have a few housekeeping things to go over before we get started. So let me just kind of tell you the few things we've got going on. You can see over on your right-hand side that there is a chat box. Feel free to drop in comments, any kind of technical issues, anything like that. You can put those in the chat box. You can send messages directly to Zach Hidalgo, who's handling our IT, or to myself or Christina for anything else. We also have the option down, and it should be at the bottom, kind of towards the left-hand side. It may be at the top, depending on how you have your menu set up with Zoom. But there's a box with a Q in it that says Q&A. If you have questions specifically for Stephen, if you don't mind plugging them in the Q&A box so that we just keep up with everything. Sometimes our chat box gets a little convoluted. We want to make sure we don't miss your questions. So it would just make sure you put those in the Q&A box. We will get to those at the end of the session. All right, so that's a little bit of housekeeping. Let's move on. I'm Megan Sanders. I'm the Training and Evaluation Specialist for Partners Resource Network. And joining me today is our Director of Statewide Services, Ms. Christina Henning, as well as our speaker, Stephen Aleman from Disability Rights Texas. So we'll get him on here in just a minute. I want to tell you a little bit about who we are. Partners Resource Network is the statewide agency that operates the 3 parent training and information centers for Texas. We have the PATH Project, the PEN Project, and the TEAM Project. We are federally funded from a grant from Department of Education, Office of Special Education, known as OSEP. And then we provide parents and professionals, as well as youth, with education and information, referrals, technical assistance, and emotional support. And we deal specifically with parents of children with disabilities birth to 26. So if you are looking for any assistance with IEPs, educational issues, anything like that, feel free to reach out to us. All right, well, Stephen, let me introduce you, and then we will get you started. So this is Stephen Aleman. He is an attorney and policy specialist with Disability Rights Texas. Prior to joining Disability Rights, Stephen had many years of experience in policy analysis, law, mediation, and teaching, all connected to individuals with disabilities. He has worked in Washington, D.C. at the federal level and in Austin at the state level. Drawing on his broad range of experience, Stephen serves as the in-house expert at Disability Rights Texas on education issues affecting students with disabilities in Texas. So thank you for joining us today, Stephen, and I will let you get started.
Well, great. Well, thank you for having me, and look forward to having this discussion and recap the recently concluded legislative session. Just as a broad overview, we can go to the next slide, please. I've organized the presentation in 3 parts, but really we're going to focus the bulk of the time, of course, on bill reviews. Next slide, please. And next slide. Just as a quick overview, I just want to highlight one very significant development in the 86th legislature that really did make a big difference in the productivity of the session, and that is that the House of Representatives had a new speaker, Dennis Bonnen. It was the first time in 10 years that the Texas House membership elected a new leader, Texas Speaker, and that new election really did play, I think, a big role in the focus on education legislation and getting many bills accomplished. Next slide. Another key factor to this being really a public school session is that the governor in early February declared several emergency items for the 86th legislature. And as you can see on the slide, several were connected to public education. So that also set a tone for getting things accomplished for all students, including students with disabilities. Next slide. I'm ready to go ahead and jump into a review of legislation. Just a couple of key points. There are so many bills to talk about. I've selected just a handful of bills to focus on that really are connected to special education services or have a very immediate and direct impact on students with disabilities. So I want to, first of all, let the audience know that there's so many different bills we could talk about, but we are really just going to highlight just some of them. And even with the bills that I have selected for today's review, I want to let you know there's so many details in many of these bills that we're just providing a very high-level summary. So I do encourage you to go take a look at the legislation itself if you have an interest. And I think we need to find a slide that says resources on bills. It might be, can't quite tell where we are, if we need to maybe go one more forward, please. If we can, there we go. So I want to highlight in particular one website called Texas Legislature Online. On this website, you can find a lot of information on the legislative session. You can find all of the legislative hearings that were held, including video recordings. You can find all the versions of the pieces of legislation, from what the introduced version looked like to what it looked like when it passed maybe the Texas Senate, to eventually what did it look like when the governor signed it. Just to point out, if you go into the search bar that you see at the very top center, all you need to do is put in either HB or SB for House Bill or Senate Bill, space, and then the bill number. When you do that, you will see several tabs across the top of the page. You'll select the tab that says text, T-E-X-T. When you pick that particular tab, you'll see a list of different versions of the bill. It's sort of counterintuitive, but the very last listing at the very bottom of that page is the most current version of the bill. That's the version you want to read and review, not the very top listed version of the bill. So again, I want to point this out as a way to follow up on my presentation for you to actually go see the legislation, see all the fine print that's important if you have a particular interest in a piece of legislation. Next slide. So in talking about the legislative session and what happened affecting students with disabilities, I've organized my summary into 8 areas. And so we're going to go through each of these 8 areas, hopefully in the time that we have this afternoon. I'm happy to take questions as I'm discussing a piece of legislation, but also to let you know we have set aside time at the very end to talk about and going back to a bill I've covered, as well as if you have other general questions about this or questions about other bills I might not have mentioned that you have heard of, I'm also happy to try to do that. But let's go ahead and get to our first topic, which was one of the biggest issues at the legislature this year, and that is school finance. Next slide. So the key bill that passed is called House Bill 3 or HB 3, and it has to deal with comprehensive school finance reform. And it was introduced and managed by Chairman Huberty, the chair of the House Public Education Committee. Next slide. And just to let you know, this is a huge piece of legislation. It's over 300 pages long. I'm not going to try to get through all of it at all. I just want to focus on really the key provisions affecting students with disabilities. And we'll go ahead and move right into those changes right now. Next slide, please. The first thing I want to focus on is a new funding stream affecting a subpopulation of students with disabilities, and those are our students with dyslexia and related disorders. The legislature created a new specific state funding stream to support the education of students with dyslexia and related disorders. It's important to note, first of all, that there's some qualifications in the bill as to when the school district is eligible to receive the allotment. It's going to be approximately $600 per student. That amount is an estimated amount. We'll find out once the school year gets going and the calculations are generated as to how much it will be, but it is based upon a couple of key things. First of all, that the student has either a Section 504 plan under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, or an Individualized Education Program, or IEP, under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA. So either a student in special education or a student just receiving accommodations under a Section 504 plan, as long as they're identified as a student with dyslexia, that's one of the first key elements to determine state funding. The other key element to bring to your attention is that the student has to be receiving dyslexia interventions in accordance with program guidelines that are set by our State Board of Education. When it comes to students with dyslexia, our attendees might know this already, but I want to point out that the State Board of Education, in conjunction with the Texas Education Agency, both have jurisdiction over educational programming for kids with dyslexia. And so the funding allotment is set up to make sure that only those kids who are receiving the services in accordance with the State Board of Ed guidelines are eligible for the funding. Another key point I want to make about the new dyslexia allotment is how schools may use that money. It is important to point out that there is no specific direction given to school districts to use the money to specifically pour back into resources for kids with dyslexia. There is, however, one key provision that parents will want to know about, and that is an allowance for up to 20% of the state money to be used by the school district to in turn contract with private providers in the area to provide what are known as supplemental academic services. The supplemental academic services would be provided by an out-of-school provider, someone in the community that provides dyslexia services or interventions, provided that those services are in alignment with what the student is receiving in their 504 plan or their IEP. I want to point out two key limitations on this. One is that the student is not allowed to leave school early or come to school late for that matter in order to receive these private services. These are after school or before school services that have to be scheduled. And finally, about the dyslexia allotment and this set aside for helping students receive out of school services, it is totally up to the school district to decide whether or not to use this funding for this purpose. So I encourage parents of kids with dyslexia to talk with your school district leadership, including your board of trustees, to perhaps adopting a resolution allowing your school district to take advantage of this set aside for helping students with dyslexia, in addition to the basic course required services they're entitled to under Section 504 and IDEA. Next slide. Another key funding addition in House 3 is that we have new money set aside to help school districts when they see some real achievements by students with disabilities once they leave public education. This is called the Outcomes Bonus, and in the Outcomes Bonus, there will be $2,000 provided to a school district if their prior special ed students graduate and achieve certain thresholds in the area of college readiness, career readiness, or military readiness. Students who have already passed through the system and achieved those outcome measures will be the first set of students that will generate this outcomes bonus for districts in this coming school year. I want to point out in wrapping up on this new outcomes bonus that there is no specific requirement that the outcomes bonus funds be poured back into special education. They'll go into the general revenue of the school district. But again, parents who have an interest in this funding could perhaps ask the school district to make sure this bonus money goes back into the system for the students that generate the money. Next slide, please. This is a very key change in our special ed funding formula. The next change to talk about is an increase in what we call mainstream weight. As we know, most students with disabilities, about 69% of our students with disabilities, spend at least 80% or more of their day in a regular education classroom. For those students, schools will receive a little bit of a boost in the aid that they receive from the state in order to help support those mainstream placements. Next slide. I want to just touch upon a couple of other key provisions in House Bill 3, and then we'll move on. Finally, I want to note about a special education advisory committee that's going to be formed this fall that will issue a report next year on how we can continue to improve financial support for special education and students with disabilities. Next slide. And just a couple of other key things to point out in House Bill 3 to wrap up, that there's new authority for schools to give a bonus to teachers specifically who have completed autism training. That there is requirements now that small and what we call mid-sized school districts don't get hurt in the revision of our school finance system when it comes to special education supports. And finally, in terms of the state level of spending for special education, if there are any issues with the state maintaining its financial support for special ed, the Commissioner of Education now has the power to transfer funds to make sure that the state spending level for special ed remains at least consistent with the prior year spending statewide. Next slide. The next bill I'm going to talk about is Senate Bill 500 by Chairman Nelson of the Senate Finance Commission. It makes an amendment to this current year's state budget. Next slide. And the key thing to point out here is that we've added hundreds of millions of dollars to ensure that the state's level of investment for students with disabilities is in compliance with federal requirements. $108 million essentially has been set aside now to deal with past shortfalls in state spending on special ed. And this school year, this fiscal year, I should say, that ends here at the end of August, school districts are going to be receiving $111.6 million in supplemental funding to help them the requirements of special education. Next slide. And I know that we're moving through this all very, very quickly. And I apologize for the pace of the presentation, but there's just so much that did happen connected to students with disabilities. And the time that we have, we're going to move through this all pretty fast. And that's why I wanted to point out the Texas Legislature online website that you can go see a lot of these details for yourself, as well as we'll get into any follow-up questions as we move along. Next area is child fine. I just have one bill to highlight there, and that is by Senator Rodriguez from El Paso. Next slide. And this is a bill that I would really like everyone to pay attention to, because this coming school year, all school districts in Texas have to notify all public school students to remind them that they have the right for a special education evaluation. The Texas Education Agency is responsible for developing a model notice. This coming school year, school districts are required to distribute this model notice in both English and Spanish and other languages, if necessary, to make sure that we all know that the 8.5% cap that was previously enforced by the state in terms of limiting special ed enrollment is no more, and that any parent who believes that their child needs special ed services will have information they need to request an evaluation for special ed services. Next slide. This is a very big topic, public school safety. I'm going to highlight just a couple of bills, although there was other legislation. The landmark legislation with regard to school safety is Senate Bill 11 by Chairman Taylor of the Senate Education Committee, and that concerns school safety and security. Next slide, please. I'm going to only focus on the provisions that really deal with students themselves and not about all the money about putting in bulletproof glass or metal detectors, although that is still important for school safety. I want to focus on something known as threat assessments. This is a new process where every school campus will have available to them a threat assessment team. The threat assessment team, most critically, will be doing what we call threat assessments. Next slide, please. The team that is put together, as you can see at the top of this slide, has to have expertise in several areas, and that includes special education. The team will get training. There'll be new guidelines that include when the threat assessment meets about a team, whether or not if they notice that a student should be referred for special ed services or testing for special ed services, they are aware of those procedures. Next slide. But most importantly, the threat assessment teams are going to be doing two things. They're going to be assessing and reporting about individuals who make threats of violence or exhibit harmful, threatening, or violent behavior. And second of all, determining the level of risk and appropriate interventions, including whether the child should be referred for mental health assessments or some sort of escalation procedure should be developed and followed. It's important to point out that, go back to that slide, I'm sorry. It's important to point out that the threat assessment team must take immediate action if they determine that the student poses a serious risk of violence to themselves or to others at the school. They'll notify the superintendent, otherwise has to then follow the protocol. So threat assessment teams are highlighted here because obviously for students with disabilities, sometimes there are behavioral issues associated with that disability, and we want to make sure that a student isn't really being punished because of their disability-related behavior. But on the other hand, we want to make sure that schools are safe and violence is prevented or minimized. So being aware that there will be threat assessment teams at your campus is something watching for and learning more about how they'll operate at your particular school. Next slide, please. Otherwise, within Senate Bill 11, there will be a new safe and supportive school program where TEA will be helping schools do a number of things to promote school safety. Next slide. Another key part of Senate Bill 11 that I want to point out is the requirements for a multi-hazard emergency operations plan. Multi-hazard emergency operation plans are not new, but what is new is that coming this fall, every plan should be revised to ensure that it has a section that deals with students with disabilities and ensuring that students with disabilities are provided equal access to safety during a natural disaster or an emergency situation. So if you're a parent of a student with a disability and are worried about, well, what happens to my child if something bad happens at the school and the emergency operations plan is activated, you might want to ask your campus principal about, well, has the plan been updated about how students with disabilities are provided equal access to safety? Moving on to the next slide, please. I want to also point out that there's a very new provision in here with regard to police officers. We obviously know that there's going to be a lot of emphasis on more security at campuses. One of the things added to Senate Bill 11 is a provision to make sure that all peace officers receive training regardless of the size of the school district as required by something known as the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement. The Texas Commission on Law Enforcement has a particular curriculum devoted to police officers who will be at public schools that includes very important topics such as child and adolescent development, positive behavioral interventions and supports, de-escalation, and how to address mental behavioral health needs. Every peace officer in Texas should be getting this training. So if you have any concerns about police being present on your campus and whether they have adequate training, you may want to ask if they had all of the TCLE training requirements met. Next slide. Moving on to the topic of mental health, which in the legislative session was very much connected to school safety. I'm going to carry on the presentation about Senate Bill 11, but address the provisions that were more focused on student mental health in addition to school safety. Next slide, please. There were several key things in Senate Bill 11 as well to go beyond school safety to address mental health. And those include a new statewide plan for student mental health, a new mental health rubric, and a new statewide inventory of mental health resources. Next slide, please. Also, we want to point out that there is more money coming to school districts as well for school safety, and this is going to be known as the School Safety Allotment. And it's important to point out that there are uses of this money beyond buying metal detectors and better locks for doors. It includes money for prevention and treatment programs, providing mental health personnel, and providing behavioral health supports, but that's all at the discretion of the school district. So if you believe that your school district needs to do more for public safety at schools beyond the physical aspects of it and the police aspects of it, you might want to encourage your school district to use the safety allotment for these other allowed expenses. Next slide, please. I want to touch upon another key bill during the legislative session connected to mental health, and that is House Bill 18 by Chairman Price, who's had a long history of working in this area of student mental health. Next slide. And one of the key things here is that there will be a new guide to helping school districts access services through our existing health and human services structure. So there'll be collaboration with the Texas Department of Health and Human Services and TEA to help schools make sure they're getting the most out of available federal and state aid connected to mental health, so that students with disabilities can also access those services. Next slide. One big transformational effort connected to student mental health is taking some of the duties connected to student mental health have previously been under the jurisdiction of the Texas Department of State Health Services and transferring those functions to the Texas Education Agency. So this is a big part of a reorganization of government to focus presumably and hopefully better services for student mental health by charging the education agency with making sure that there's follow-up, making sure there's resources. And among other things, TEA will be responsible for a list of best practices and disseminating those to school districts. Next slide, please. There is also a current structure that are known as school-based health centers that school districts may operate in Texas to provide comprehensive health care services. The key provision in House Bill 18 connected to these school-based health centers is an allowance now that they may provide treatment for mental health conditions. Next slide, please. I also want to point out that House Bill 18 deals with school counselors in several ways. Most importantly, the educational requirements for mental health or for school counselors, will include more training concerning mental health conditions, and that school districts and their school counselors will be working on trying to transform the delivery system of counseling services to students across the board, including students with disabilities, by focusing on a new model called the Texas Model for Comprehensive School Counseling. So if you have an interest in school counselors and how they're meeting the needs of students with disabilities, you may want to ask about how school counselors are doing in promoting and implementing this new Texas model. Next slide, please. Finally, in House Bill 18, there's new authority specifically that school districts, resources permitting, may hire non-physician mental health professionals to come in and supplement staff to deal with mental health conditions of the student body. Next slide, please. In addition to the other focus in these other bills on mental health, there was another bill to highlight called House Bill 19, again by Chairman Price. Next slide, please. And this focuses, again, on existing structures, what we call local mental health authorities. And the idea here is to promote partnerships between existing local mental health authority and school districts by basically having local mental health authorities hire someone devoted to student mental health and placing those experts at the regional service centers across Texas. There are 20, who in turn will help consult with school districts to make sure that student mental health needs are being met. Next slide, please. Moving on to our next topic of transition, I want to highlight House Bill 165 by Vice Chair Bernal. Representative Bernal is Vice Chair of the House Public Education Committee, and his bill dealt with high school endorsements for students with disabilities. Next slide, please. As you probably know, there are 5 endorsements under our Foundation Diploma Program. There's a STEM endorsement, there is a public service endorsement, there's an arts and humanities endorsement, a business and industry endorsement, a multidisciplinary studies endorsement. Students with disabilities now have access to those by way of the Admission, Review, and Dismissal, or ARD committee, making decisions that revisions to those programs, those courses connected to the endorsement, even if the curriculum is modified, still entitles the student to graduate with that endorsement. Next slide, please. Another key transition bill is House Bill 2184 by Representative Allen. Next slide. And this deals with actually all kinds of students, including students with disabilities who might have been removed long-term because of a disciplinary issue. When they come back to school, there will now be a new planning effort connected to them. So in addition to their transition plan, they may have what is called a personalized transition plan, or PTP. The personalized transition plan is to help them make a smooth return to their regular education program now that they have finished their disciplinary removal. So with regard to students with disabilities, the ARD committee should be coordinating and having a role in consultation with the development of the personalized transition plan. Next slide, please. There are several bills connected to discipline I just want to highlight right now. And I have 2 bills listed on this slide because they both were enacted and are essentially the same bill. Senate Bill 712 and House Bill 3630 deal with aversive techniques. Slide, please. These 2 pieces of legislation now prohibit the use of aversive techniques on all students, including students with disabilities. Well, what are aversive techniques? Generally, they are methods that intentionally inflict significant physical or emotional pain or discomfort on a person such as a student, in an attempt to reduce or stop some sort of recurring behavior that is being exhibited by the student that is bothering the school, bothering the institution. Now, school districts may not use aversive techniques. What do we exactly mean specifically about aversive techniques? You'll have to take a look at section 37.0023 of the Education Code, because quite honestly, there is a long list now. What approaches to behavior have been labeled as an aversive technique, which you may not now use. So if your student is subject to some sort of behavior management, aversive techniques that try to stop a behavior, minimize a behavior, you want to make sure that you're aware of what are now the prohibited techniques in section 37.023, which this coming fall should no longer be used or be allowed into a behavioral intervention plan or individualized education program. Next slide, please. I want to point out another key bill which will be important to some students with disabilities, Senate Bill 2432. Next slide, please. Senate Bill 2432 deals with, quote, mandatory removals to disciplinary alternative education programs, or what we call DAEPs. The center of this mandatory removal authority, and there's other mandatory removal authorities already in the Education Code, I want to be clear, but now the list has been expanded to include behaviors associated essentially with harassment. And the notion is if a student with or without a disability is engaged in harassing behavior, the school district has to remove that student and send them to DAEP. Again, for students with disabilities who might have certain behavioral issues, this might pose a challenge to implement and walk that fine line between not punishing it for behaviors connected with their disability and also wanting to maintain a positive school environment. I want to point out, even with the addition of this new quote, mandatory removal authority, schools nonetheless have to abide by Texas Education Code section 37.004, which reinforces that all schools always have to comply with disciplinary procedures under IDEA, and that includes the manifestation determination review and requirements for the continuation of FAPE, even if a student is removed to a DAEP. Next slide. Another discipline bill I'll just touch on briefly is Senate Bill 1707. Next slide. And it's important to point out, with the emphasis on school safety and the possibility that there will be more police officers in and around schools, this piece of legislation specifically says that school districts may not ask school resource officers on loan from the neighboring jurisdiction to deal with routine student discipline. Obviously, if there are situations going on, such as a fight, and a police officer is needed, that's not what we're talking about. But just in general, police officers should not have a role in school discipline. And this bill requires there to be policies at the local level. So if you have concerns about the interaction of students and law enforcement on the campus, be aware of Senate Bill 1707. Next slide, please. Let me move to some specific areas connected to certain subpopulations of students with disabilities. Senate Bill 2075 deals with students with dyslexia and related disorders. Next slide, please. Senate Bill 2075 follows up on legislation from last legislative session to mandate that there be more robust screening at the early grade levels so that we catch students who might have dyslexia-related disorder. This legislative session, the follow-up was a bill, SB 2075, that gives specific authority to TEA to go out and monitor school districts that they're following state law with regard to dyslexia. So if you have any concerns about your school district not following state law about dyslexia, then there's now a recourse to have TEA step in and direct reasonable and appropriate remedial strategies if you think your school district is not doing the right thing with regard to students with dyslexia. Next slide, please. House Bill 548 deals with students who are deaf and hard of hearing. Slide, please. There is concern that students who are deaf and hard of hearing aren't always getting all the language skills that they need to be successful in school and life after school. So House Bill 548 now mandates new assessments of language acquisition of students who are deaf and hard of hearing. The assessments will be decided later this year from TEA and information given to school districts. And then in turn, school districts will be aggregating this information and turning it back into TEA. So we have at least a statewide measure of how this subpopulation of students with disabilities, those students who are deaf, are doing in terms of the fundamental issue of language and communication. Next slide, please. Senate Bill 54 deals with another issue connected to students who are deaf. Next slide, please. This bill requires a new study for students who have left their home district and have gone to what we call a regional day school program for the deaf, and ensuring that those students don't fall through the cracks in terms of state accountability. Who ultimately has the responsibility to be held accountable for students who are out of their home district and are attending the regional day school program for the deaf? The report required by Senate Bill 54 will be due next fall, so we'll see how that turns out. Next slide, please. I'm going to conclude now, I think, because we're coming up on the conclusion of my time for my presentation, with Senate Bill 522, and this deals with actually another subpopulation, students with visual impairments. Next slide. This has to deal with Braille instruction. State law has always talked about instruction in Braille for students with visual impairments. What's new now is that schools must more carefully evaluate and consider whether Braille is the appropriate literacy medium for that particular student with a visual impairment. They otherwise have to include Braille instruction in the IEP, but if the ARD committee decides that Braille isn't right for this particular student, then they are exempt from imposing Braille instruction or inserting Braille instruction into the IEP. It's important to note that everyone who's connected with that decision has to be aware about what Braille instruction really is all about before they make that particular assessment and recommendation. But for students who have visual impairments, this will be an important review in this upcoming school year with regard to their IEPs. So, next slide, please. We have left time for questions, and I think we're already getting already at least about a dozen questions. But let me just wrap up the formal part of my presentation by talking about where we go now that the session has ended. Next slide, please. So obviously there's some key things that happen. The legislative session is over. Next, we turn to the Texas Education Agency to implement all of these new laws, in part by amending and updating state regulations. So that will be a public process. So you have an interest in a particular area, we want to be mindful that there will be a public process for TEA to amend or establish new regulations. Next, there'll obviously be a lot of training going on by different educational associations, by the regional service center, by TEA, by entities like Partners Resource Network. So there'll be plenty of opportunity to learn about the new laws and what they mean and all the nuances involved with them in the coming months. And finally, be aware that the Texas legislature will start to have what we call interim hearings, not until 2020, but they will be doing oversight hearings on all of these bills and talking about, did we get it right? How's it going out in the field with parents and school districts and teachers? So if you have broad concerns about, did we really do the right thing, there'll be a chance to speak to lawmakers about those concerns and fixes that might come up in 2021. So again, know that that was a very quick run through. The slides, I want to point out, have lots of information that we did not specifically cover. And also, again, on TLO, Texas Legislature online website, we have the resource for you to really dig in and see legislation. But next slide. I think we're ready for questions, Megan.
I got it, Megan. Give me a second. There you Christina would quit muting me. We'd be good. Yes, it's the system does it automatically. Don't blame me. All right, Stephen. So we do have some questions coming in. If you do have additional questions for Stephen, feel free to go ahead and drop those in the Q&A box now, and we will make our way down the list. All right, so first question for you, Stephen. When we're talking about the dyslexia allotment, was that amount annual or was it monthly?
Generally speaking, all the figures will be as an annual amount given to school districts. So depending upon the school district's enrollment of students with dyslexia and that they meet the markers that are set out in the legislation, then the school district will get approximately $600 for that school year. And I want to point out, they're not getting anything right now. So while $600 may not sound like a lot, it is way more than they were getting before.
All right. Okay, so next question. I currently have an ongoing TEA investigation regarding dyslexia services in my children's school district, which is the Wilson program, is not being followed with fidelity. In fact, none of the staff has the level 1 certification that the program says teachers need. And TEA is saying the dyslexia handbook is best practice. Do you have any advice or guidance for the parent?
Well, obviously, I'll mention this now, and that if you have individual issues, feel free to contact Disability Rights Texas and go through our intake process, either by a phone call or our online referral system on our website. We'll be happy to consider what the issues are and whether we're in a position to help you. But just in general, in the connection to this presentation, again, pointing out that one of the key pieces of legislation that was passed has to do with making sure that TEA is in the position to enforce state law with regard to students with dyslexia. So I think that process will be really important to make sure it's rolled out correctly and is robustly deployed to enforce state law. So we'll have to, of course, wait for staffing to happen on that front and find out exactly who is in charge.
All right. Okay, I don't know this next one if it's a question or a comment. I will read it. School districts are not specifying a particular dyslexia program, but intervention from different programs. So if there is a question behind that, if the person will just follow up and let me know. Okay, this one's related to Child Find. Does the MOU on coordination of services in residential facilities apply to the children in detention facilities at the Texas border, specifically Child Find and sharing data components?
So when it comes to the federal detention centers or camps that we're hearing all about in the news recently, that's a very unique situation because these children are in federal detention in custody, and unless there's somehow an ability for the student to reach a local school district, they're not really getting involved in the whole child find evaluation referral process. So it's a very unique issue with regard to the migrant and immigrant children who are being held by the federal government that I want to say certainly we are concerned about at Disability Rights Texas, but it's a totally unique legal situation that is separate than what other mostly students in Texas are facing in terms of their legal rights and remedies.
Okay, what are the guidelines for the autism training that teachers are to complete?
So specific in House Bill 3 is an authority for school districts to pay a bonus to a teacher who completes autism training. The legislation only says that that training has to be provided by a regional education service center. So as long as it meets that requirement, then the teacher is eligible to receive that training. That's in the context of what we covered today. Otherwise, there are ongoing legal requirements for all teachers to receive continuing education, but there's nothing specific that says that they have to receive a certain amount of autism-specific training.
All right. The money coming to school districts, will that be affected or returned as part of Robin Hood if the district pays that?
I'm sorry, Megan, can you repeat that last question?
Yeah, not exactly sure on the wording of this question. It says the money coming into school districts, will that be affected or returned as part of Robin Hood if the district pays that?
Okay, so very broadly with regard to House Bill 3 and school finance reform, we only focus on the provisions that deal with how the state gives money to school districts under what we call the Foundation School Program. There's a whole nother side of school finance, which is how do we collect the revenue, both at the local and state level, to pay for public education in Texas. And that's where the notion of what Robin Hood comes into place. Robin Hood is sort of what we refer to as recapture under the law, and recapture is essentially sharing the wealth of Texas so that all public schools can be funded at a fair level. There is an emphasis in House Bill 3 to minimize recapture or Robin Hood. It will still happen, but in general, school districts will be returning less money to the state than did before under House Bill 3.
Okay. Will mental health emphasis allow for mental health professionals access to students in school, such as the YES waiver providers? Schools claim they cannot allow access due to FERPA or school policy.
So as I mentioned in one of the pieces of legislation, I have to double check if it was House Bill 18. I believe there's specific authority for them to hire non-medical mental health professionals to come in and work with students with disabilities and other students with mental health issues. In terms of access to the student body, I think that would have to go hand in hand. You're not going to hire a whole bunch of new people who then don't have access to the students that are meant to help. So, I mean, obviously at a certain level, there are concerns with confidentiality and protecting privacy. But House 18, because it makes this specific provision about hiring non-physician mental health professionals, and you use the correct phrase, non-physician mental health professionals, I imagine that there will have to be policies that allow that access to the student body to help them.
All right, perfect. Let's see. When does House Bill 2184 transition plan take effect?
Let me double check my notes about that. In general, all of the legislation I've been discussing let me point out, takes effect this coming school year. So with regard to the issue of House Bill 2184 and students who might have been removed because of disciplinary issues and are now coming back to schools, those provisions will take effect this coming school year for the first time, including the development of the personalized transition plan requirement.
All right. Can you repeat the bill about modified curriculum and endorsement classes?
Sure. House Bill 165, House Bill 165 by Representative Bernal of San Antonio makes a change to what we call our foundation diploma program. There are 5 possible endorsements. Right now, current law says that if you have to have some modified curriculum in one of the courses required for an endorsement, a student with a disability automatically is ineligible to receive that endorsement. Now, House Bill 165 makes an endorsement possible, not automatic, but possible, depending upon what the admission review and dismissal or ARD committee says.
All right. Here is a question regarding aversive techniques. Is CPI, which is the crisis preventional intervention, considered aversive?
I will say for sure that CPI is not specifically mentioned. However, as I said, there are a long list of defined prohibited techniques in the new aversive provision, and we would just have to take a look at that and then turn next to the implementing regulations by DEA to see whether or not CPI is prohibited. But I would probably say, generally speaking, CPI probably would not be considered an aversive technique, would be my initial read of the legislation.
Okay. Let's see. Does the bill for the hearing impaired include children with central auditory process disorder?
So with regard to the bill that has to do with language acquisition, I'm going to guess. I will say that it speaks to students who are deaf, as that is sort of the code or the level in special education in the PEAMS coding. So if a student has a central auditory processing disorder that results in them being coded as deaf or hard of hearing, as opposed to, let's say, other health impaired, that would be the key factor to look at.
Right. Okay. We have clarification to the question above. School districts address the various dyslexia deficits using different dyslexia programs. So they're not defining like the program itself, right? I think is what we're asking here. That goes back to that comment that says school districts are not specifying a particular program, but intervention from different programs.
I guess I would just point out that, I mean, there's 2 different levels. If you have a very specific individual issue, I would consider your procedural safeguards, depending on whether or not you're a student under Section 504 or a student under IDEA. You have procedural safeguards under both laws. The only issue is that the nature of those procedural safeguards are a little different. So there's that individual level review about whether the programming interventions are appropriate. But more systemically, what we're focusing on is the ability of TEA to go out and enforce and make sure that school districts overall are providing dyslexia services. And when TEA does monitoring, I mean, in theory, it's not haphazard. They have to develop a monitoring protocol. So I think what really for me, the question gets to is what standards will TEA be looking for in programs when they go on site to review dyslexia services in a particular school district? That's a policy issue we've not yet gotten to, the development of the dyslexia monitoring protocol. But I think it will be something that we'll be mindful of. And it's one of those situations where for the public, it's very hard to be aware of. But we'll do our best to let the public know as the dyslexia monitoring system is rolled out that it's happening, and here are some chances to provide some input.
All right. What guidance can you offer when explaining training on the House Bill 165, particularly the section about EOC requirements? I don't want the district to graduate all students with an endorsement or to lower the expectations for SPED students as a result of this bill. General ed students must pass 3 out of 5. But in reading the bill, the art committee can agree to accept participation only for all EOC.
So, sure. So obviously in any legislation that's making some quote exceptions to the general requirements, we want to balance maintaining high standards and expectations for all students with disabilities, while also acknowledging that accommodations and some interventions are necessary. So that's why the legislation doesn't have a blanket policy, but leaves it to the Admission Review and Dismissal Committee to make individualized determinations. And so incumbent in the ARD committee doing that, they'll need good guidance from both the local level and the state level and to balancing those two considerations, not trying to give students with disabilities a pass, but also trying to make sure that they have an equal opportunity to an endorsement like any other student. So that will really come down to, as we move forward, what guidance and training is there by TEA, their service centers about this, and that's something that we'll be following.
All right. Okay, under the school finance slide you shared, it talks about the new dyslexia allotment school districts will get for a student who is receiving services. At the end, it says the State Board of Education and the instruction is delivered by a person with dyslexia training. My question in regards to that slide is, what does the state consider adequate training?
Okay, so there was earlier reference to the Dyslexia Handbook, just for all of our attendees to be aware. Dyslexia policy in Texas is very unique. There is both jurisdiction by the Texas Education Agency as well as by the State Board of Education. The State Board of Education has issued what is known as the Dyslexia Handbook. There's now a relatively new addition to the Dyslexia Handbook that came out last year, I believe. And so that new version talks about recommendations and guidelines for training. We would first turn to that document to see what is recommended in our school district following those recommendations. So that would be the initial cut in terms of guidance about the qualifications and the training required for a dyslexia interventionist.
All right. What can be done if a child with a disability that is in regular education classroom setting is being harassed and parental concerns have been expressed to teachers and staff?
So as I mentioned, there is legislation that was passed that deals with a student harassing school staff and then mandatory removals because of that. But we already have protections in place to protect students with and without disabilities from harassment, if that's what I understand the nature of the question is about. And so we would want to follow the existing protocols for protecting a student who has been harassed. And so there are resources available for her about harassment, both on the Disability Rights Texas website as well as on the Texas Education Agency website that I would refer the questioner to.
Right. Some of the other questions. We are going to wrap up soon, guys. I know we have some more questions coming in the chat box as well as Q&A. Let me go ahead and get one of these questions answered. What can we do if the school district's policy regarding dyslexia and other special education areas are out of compliance or grossly out of compliance?
Well, so I think that question really goes to the new legislation with regard to dyslexia monitoring. Sort of vast systemic issues in a school district where dyslexia services are not being provided appropriately is exactly what that legislation was meant to address. So that's where we probably would say a state blank would be appropriate to the monitoring division. I want to point out that that legislation, like most of the other bills, as of right now, it's not legally sort of applicable, but coming this upcoming 2019-2020 school year, that's when that new authority will kick in. So once we have the legal threshold passed that the law is actually applying, then I would say a report to the new dyslexia monitoring unit at TEA would be appropriate.
All right. And we are getting close to that time. We're a little over an hour now. I know there's still questions coming in, and I know that some questions have not been addressed. What I do want to encourage you to do is if you have a question that is personal to like your situation, please feel free to reach out to Disability Rights Texas, fill out that intake form, and then we'll get in touch with you. Or feel free to reach out to one of our regional coordinators. And depending on your area, path, pen, or team, we'll be more than happy to assist you. If you don't know who your regional person is, feel free to let us know where you're at in the chat box or shoot me an email after this, and I will get you connected, and we'll help you further. Again, sorry, guys, we get a lot of questions. We try to get through them the best we can, but any additional questions can certainly be sent to Disability Rights or to us. Whatever method you choose to go with that. All right, so we have some webinars coming up for you guys. Starting in August, we're going to kick back off with having at least one a month, and maybe even two. We might have a few bonuses in there as well. So get prepared to join us back in August, where we get our back to school groove for webinars. We have additional slides. There we go. All right. So August 22nd, we are kicking off a new Facebook Live series gearing up for the new school year. And it will be in English and Spanish. And it will be weekly. So you see the dates here, August 22nd, the 29th, September 5th, and September 12th. With different categories, but all pertaining to like the IEP and good communication and how to really come back into school, get started with a bang. So I would encourage you to join us for those. Those will be at 12:15 English and then immediately following in Spanish. So join us for those. All right, guys. Well, this is our information. If you have questions, comments, there's something you would love to see a webinar on, we really want to hear from you. And so you can feel free to shoot those over to me or Christina, and our emails are on the current slide. Also, you can access the recordings for today's webinar and past webinars as well on our website, and that's the prntexas.org/statewide webinars. And then if you are on social media, skip on over to Facebook, look us up, give us a like, and see all that we have going on. You can join us on Facebook Live series. You can see articles we're sharing and different things like that. And thank you guys so much for joining us today. Really excited that you were able to come on and get some really great information. Thank you, Stephen, for coming on and as always giving some amazing info. We really appreciate it. And we hope you guys have a great day, and we will see you in August.